Hi, this is Harlem Stories. I'm Adam Feinberg, and I'm with my guest host today, Mark Becker. Mark, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to Uptown, what attracted you there, a little bit about your business, and then we'll get into our today's topic, which is the Battle of Harlem Heights.
Of course. Well, thanks so much for having me, Adam. I really appreciate it. As you know, I was a resident for many years of Washington Heights, and as well, I lived on 122nd and LaSalle over by Columbia University, not far from Grant's Tomb, where a lot of the fighting took place. I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you.
I've always loved Uptown Manhattan, and again, I'm an agent like Adam at Ellergren Real Estate, and I've been an agent for about 7 years now.
Awesome. Do you sell uptown? Do you sell downtown? Why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
My business is concentrated primarily in Manhattan, although actually in 2021 I was proud to say that I did a deal in the Hamptons. I did a deal around Hunter Mountain, New York. I did several deals in Manhattan and also several deals in Brooklyn. I have done a number of transactions uptown Manhattan, particularly in Washington Heights, which I know is one of your stomping grounds.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's just so much rich history in these neighborhoods, which attracts me. I've had family connections to Upper Manhattan, my entire life. I didn't even know that until actually I bought in the neighborhood. I later found this out. But in doing so, I learned so much about these neighborhoods and just how, much of American history and the history that I think our listeners are going to really value. When we're selling them a home, we're also selling them, the history of the neighborhood. Obviously, we know, big figures like George Washington have, walked through these neighborhoods and fought in these neighborhoods. Yeah. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Alexander Hamilton, his estate was up here. So all these players in early American history. But even as you go into pop culture, like in Morningside Heights, there's Tom's Diner, which was used in Seinfeld, and was the famous, I guess, song. And exactly, and there was even that song, Tom's Diner by Suzanne Vega, which has now been resampled in other songs, and it's a pop hit again in the last few years. In any case, today we're going to be talking more about the Battle of Harlem Heights and, how that impacted the history of the uptown neighborhoods. Obviously, we know that George Washington was involved, but we'd love to hear more about, your take and some interesting factoids about the Battle of Harlem Heights.
Sure, and I think it's important to begin just generally that, I'm sure this is a fairly intuitive statement, but Manhattan, like everywhere else in the world, hasn't always looked the way it looks today in 2023, amazingly.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been redefined and rebuilt up.
Yeah.
Neighborhoods have come and gone and transformed, and neighborhood borders have transformed.
Sure.
Absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, I always think back. I don't know if you've heard of the book Manhattan, but it's a fascinating book that really has some colorful depictions in paintings of what Manhattan probably looked like well before the Battle of Harlem Heights, which of course was a lot of wildlife and Native American settlements. And in fact, I'm sure you're aware, and many of our listeners may be aware as well, that Broadway was initially a Native American trail, and I'm not sure precisely where it started. I think somewhere in Yonkers maybe, but what's now present-day Yonkers, but it extended through Inwood and Washington Heights and all the way, obviously, to the tip of the island. And
if I remember correctly, at some point instead of Broadway, I think it was the old Post Road,
right,
which became the Boston Post Road, which goes from the southern tip of Manhattan all the way into Boston.
Yeah, and actually, I lived for a time in New Rochelle, and I remember distinctly taking Route 1. I believe it's US 1, which is also a Boston Post Road and is called a few different things. Particularly about what's particularly interesting about the Battle of Harlem Heights is that George Washington, the first president of the United States, was was a commander in the Battle of Harlem Heights. Now, just a little bit of background: the American Revolutionary War technically began in April of 1775, went all the way to September of 1783. The Battle of Harlem Heights took place in 1776, just a couple of months after the Lee Resolution and subsequently the Declaration of Independence were signed. Now, what's the Lee Resolution? The Lee Resolution was Richard Henry Lee, who was a founding father, created the Lee Resolution, proposed it to the First and Second Continental Congress, which effectively was an agreement, non-ratified at the time because obviously they had to fight a battle over it, which was a non-ratified agreement that the 13 colonies were going to secede from the British. And then that's how we got the Independence Day on the 4th of July, 1776, but the Lee Resolution was actually initially written on July 2nd, which is why some people, I think somewhat erroneously, but I guess it depends on how you characterize it, will say that the Declaration of Independence was actually on the 2nd of July, but the final terms were not agreed to until the 4th. So particularly as it pertains to the Battle of Harlem Heights, which started a couple of months after that, the British commander in charge was Sir William Howe. And what's interesting about Howe, sort of contrary to a lot of these figures back then, and remember, to get there from England, you had to take a boat, and it was dangerous. And people get upset now if their holiday travel plans are canceled. But I can assure you that surfing the high seas for several thousand miles is a bit more of an adventure. Howe was actually born in England and died in England, which is somewhat rare because he came to the U.S. as a military man. He was born into a military family. He was a general in the British Army, and he came to take on George Washington. And
that can't be good. I mean, George Washington is the commander of the nation, and like now looking back, hundreds of years, GW, he's the man.
It's like taking on Mike Tyson in his prime for sure. So, just as an aside, just because I'm sort of a numbers geek, Sir William Howe, the British commander who ultimately won the Battle of New York City, but lost the war, so to speak, lived to be 84 years old, which is an interesting fact about him.
That's pretty old back then.
Yeah. If you look at historical figures of that period, and I actually looked this up on Google, the average life expectancy back then was only about 50.
Yeah, and that's even younger than I thought. I thought it was going to be like something like 60. So that's 84 is a pretty ripe old age at that point.
Oh yeah. Who knows if he had all his marbles by then? But he certainly was a good commander in the Battle of Harlem Heights. Now, one of the things that was interesting about the Battle of the Harlem Heights, as I researched it, was actually the British wanted to focus more on Newport, Rhode Island, which was even more of an important port at the time. Obviously this country has an unfortunate history of slavery. A lot of the slave traffic was sort of funneled through Newport in the triangular trade between the Caribbean and Africa and Newport, Rhode Island. They didn't really want to commit a lot of resources to the Battle of Harlem Heights, but ultimately they had to. And a couple of fascinating things about that was the battles themselves took place predominantly in what is currently the area around Barnard College in Upper Manhattan, which is to say, if you go up Broadway at you know where this is, 106th, be somewhere between 116th and 125th Street. That's also where Grant's tomb is located. This was...
And by the way, Barnard is absolutely, while it's affiliated with Columbia University,
Yeah.
it's its own school, and it's an absolutely tiny campus.
Yeah.
It's only something like roughly, I'm thinking off the top of my head, but it's only roughly around 2.5 acres large.
Yeah.
So it's not a very large campus. It's somewhere, you're right, around 116th, 118th, somewhere in that vicinity. But it's a very small campus. But, as you correctly stated, I know that quite a bit of the Battle of Harlem Heights, took place right around there.
Right. And Washington was, as a commander, was perched in an elevated area around there in order to see the advancing troops so that he could have a view of a bird's eye view, so to speak, of the action. Now, one of the things... Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, and anybody that knows the present geography today, that geography hasn't changed dramatically over the years. So, if you're at around 116th, 117th, you're toward sort of the top of a steep hill.
Yeah.
And as you go toward 125th Street, that goes more toward the valley.
Yes.
So it's kind of a downward slope. It's always been that way, and while the gradations might have changed over a couple hundred years, ultimately it's more or less pretty close to the way it looked back then.
Right, and I've always sort of surmised, perhaps incorrectly, it's just a theory, that one of the reasons as you go further uptown it gets a little more affordable is because it's not as flat and it's not as easily walkable as, say, Midtown Manhattan.
I would agree with that, yeah.
Particularly when you get below 96th Street or so, or even, more so Columbus Circle. I would say below 59th Street to the tip of the island, there's almost no hills. It's practically non-existent, very flat area, which obviously
Which wasn't always the case, but over the years and as New York City transformed, obviously we saw it was even flatter. We know that there was a lot of marshland and there were a lot of rivers that were formed. Today there are rivers, including in Upper Manhattan, that are underground, and we'll be talking about that a little bit more in the episode where we talk about Columbia's University and nuclear reactors and nuclear testing facility. So we'll be talking a lot more about that in an upcoming episode.
Awesome. So the Battle of Harlem Heights took place. Washington had actually received some reports that ended up being unfounded, that the British were advancing. So he amassed 150 men under the command of a guy named Thomas Knowlton. Now, Thomas Knowlton was an interesting character, primarily because he's considered the first intelligence official in United States history. So
that's awesome. That's a nice little nugget to know.
Yeah. So he was actually a spy on the British, and a fairly successful one. But unfortunately for Knowlton, he was the highest-ranking official killed in the Battle of Harlem Heights. There were it's supposedly about 30 casualties. Hard to say if that number, give or take, is completely accurate on the American side.
I guess that's how it goes when you're in the spy business.
Yeah. He was the most useful, and that's the guy that they decided to take out. So Thomas Knowlton lived a short yet rather glorious life. He died on that day, 16th of September, 1776, defending New York City against the British as a colonialist. Died at the age of 35. So rest in peace, Thomas Knowlton, and thanks for your contribution. We should really have a Thomas Knowlton Day here in the United States. It's a shame that we don't. I need to give him more press.
Maybe the CIA does, but you know how the CIA is. They're pretty quiet on everything.
They're not going to tell us if there's a Thomas Knowlton Day. So Knowlton took his troops, and a majority of the fighting happened in, as we had said, around where Barnard College is now. And fascinatingly, there were several farms in the area. Now, again, it's you're just trying to get the audience to picture Harlem, the Columbia campus, Tom's Restaurant, that whole area, and as industrial and built up as it is now, at the time was just farmland. And we as Americans in a young country, our country's about 250 years old, it's hard for us to conceptualize that 1776, relatively speaking, wasn't that long ago.
It wasn't.
It really was not. And as I get older, it seems like less time. So anyway, in comparison to countries like France, England, Germany, Spain, whose histories go back.
They look at our buildings that are like mid 1800s and like that's not old.
That's new construction. So it's interesting to look at it through that lens, and anyone interested in the Battle of Harlem Heights, if you look it up online and look at sort of the various depictions of it, you can see that the areas in which the fighting took place are quite hilly, and there's one in particular that I found through the New York Public Library that I'm not sure exactly what I'm looking at, but it does certainly look like it could be that area of 125th Street where it sort of starts to go at a diagonal, as it heads west.
Yeah, it's
right.
Like that 125th, 126th, and then you'll notice even on the grid today, it jumps from 126th to 130th as the next block.
Right.
And that's as a result of the original construction of the way, the grid kind of worked itself around there.
Yeah.
Now, that 125th Street area right over there on the Hudson, that was actually a major shipping port, and we'll get more into that, as we talk more about the history of Manhattanville. Vanderwater, which we now know as primarily as a luxury condo building on 122nd, right off Broadway. But Vanderwater was actually owned. That was actually the name of one of the farms and one of the farm families.
Yeah.
So that goes all the way back into that history. And as you mentioned and talked about, like the farmland, 125th Street area, and that low 130s area, right off of Broadway, west of Broadway. That was actually, one of the largest dairy production and bottling plant areas in the entire nation.
Wow.
And we'll talk more about that when we get into the Manhattanville, episodes. But,
sure.
It's amazing how these neighborhoods, just continue to redefine themselves. So I know that especially, and I'm sure you probably noticed that, living in Harlem too, is, people are afraid of change and are like, this is not, blah, blah, blah. We don't want this. This is all change. And, we want this. But throughout the history of our time, and that's one of the most important things that we like to convey in this podcast, is that, time changes these neighborhoods over and over and over again. Most people are surprised when I tell them that, that area around Broadway and 110th Street was actually like almost like a row of like restaurant, bar, like tavern, vaudeville type of places right around that area. So they're kind of shocked on like how these neighborhoods have changed and transformed over the years. So going back to what you were saying about the farms, I'm like, yeah, all Manhattan was either swamps or farms or
Sure.
Some of these neighborhoods have just transformed radically as we evolved.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think if you think about just getting back to the Battle of Harlem Heights, the Cotton Club.
Yeah. Well, the original Cotton Club was on the other side of Harlem,
right.
but there's now the new iteration of the
right.
Cotton Club. Yeah.
And then Dinosaur Barbecue, I guess. So just for our audience to kind of conceptualize this, we're talking about now iconic retail establishments like Dinosaur or Cotton Club. And it's very quite probable that George Washington or Thomas Knowlton actually walked on that ground back when it was farmland. And
I would tend to say highly likely, very highly likely.
Absolutely probable. And Washington had, as I mentioned, it's a hilly area. Washington had a perch. I believe, actually, just as an aside, and I'm sure you know this one, Adam, because you're a Washington Heights expert, the highest area in Manhattan, I think, is actually at the 180th Street stop off the A train, right?
Yeah, it's the northern entrance exit around 184th-ish, roughly, but it is like maybe 182, 180.
I think it's Fort Washington Street.
Yeah, it's actually in that park. I think what is that, Bennett Park?
Yes.
And
there's a plaque there. Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah,
which is how I learned that.
So yeah, it's literally right off of that northern entrance of the A train.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and anyone, not to get too into Washington Heights, but anyone who's been in that area, or Harlem, for example, 125th Street, as you know, this sort of speaks to the geography. Is an elevated train. So if you take the one train up from Upper West Side, you go head north, heading uptown, you get at 116th Street, and then all of a sudden you're outside. Now, why is that? Because there is a valley there. So you're essentially riding on a bridge, and then when the next stop, actually City College, I always found it interesting. There's literally one stop outside, and then you go back underground at City College, and of course the reason for that is the hills and the geography and the way it creates that valley there.
Yep, absolutely.
So the farms actually were owned, interestingly enough, by the Jones family, a family called Jones, and then another family called the Hoaglands. So if you can sort of picture, you've got your homestead on a piece of farm property, and the next thing you know, there's a bunch of guys with bayonets running around killing each other in your backyard. But this was the reality of the American Revolutionary War. And as I said, Thomas Knowlton was the guy that Washington handpicked to deal with that, and he unfortunately met his demise there. Now, they were known, the men in the party were known as Knowlton's Rangers, and they were a reconnaissance and espionage team established by George Washington, and it was named after Knowlton. And I believe, I'm not a military person, but I believe there's actually still some sort of an award in the Army that you can win, the Knowlton Award, as I'm probably butchering that. But
no, I think you're correct on that. I remember seeing something vaguely about that. I'm not an expert on this topic, but I do recall seeing something about that. Sure.
So they ultimately, Washington ultimately had to retreat back to what is now White Plains, and also to New Jersey. So perhaps he didn't take the George Washington Bridge. He most likely took a boat, but little did he know that the water he was sailing on would eventually have a bridge above it that bore his name. So it is quite appropriate that the George Washington Bridge is named such, because that's where General Washington had to retreat during the battle. So, as I said, a lot of this stuff was happening around Barnard College. There are still a few plaques in the area that commemorate that. And then,
so you said for just a moment that George Washington had to retreat. So did we win this battle, or did we wind up losing this battle?
So we ended up obviously winning the war, but we lost the battle.
Okay.
We lost in terms of casualties. I said it was about 30 casualties, including Commander Knowlton. And what's interesting is I was trying to get as accurate a number as possible. Usually when I go into historical records, I try to find several different sources and then sort of average them to figure out sort of, get as close to the truth as possible. What's interesting about the British casualties is there were 14 of them. And the reason I can say definitively there were I can't say it definitively, but it's fair to say there were 14.
As close as we can. Right.
every historical source that I have delved into has said that there were 14 casualties in the Battle of Harlem Heights on the British side. However, the number of the wounded varies. So maybe they had a few soccer players on their squad who pretended to be a little more hurt than they were. But so that's why those numbers vary. But 14 casualties for the British, 30 for the U.S. Washington had to jump back to White Plains and New Jersey. But ultimately, in 1883, the Revolutionary War was ended, and the First and Second Continental Congress was able to keep ratify that Lee resolution and create what we now know are the first 13 states in the United States.
That's terrific.
Yeah.
Awesome. I mean, as usual, we like to bring a lot of history into these episodes, and hopefully you find them valuable, interesting, maybe transform the way you think about these neighborhoods a little bit. I know I've had fun with this episode. I hope you can say the same.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for joining us at Harlem Stories, and we hope to have lots of more engaging, information-packed episodes for you in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Have a great day.